So language is incredibly important when building content, using contemporary language, similar to media reporting of suicide-related incidents. There are national evidence-based mind frame guidelines that journalists and media use when reporting on suicide, with a very significant focus on the use of appropriate language to really encourage help seekers to reach out, and that stigma isn't a significant challenge or barrier because of an inappropriate use of language or terminology.
Welcome to Content Matters. It's the podcast in which we go behind the scenes to look at content that builds trust in high-stakes environments. I'm your host, Natalie, and today we're speaking with Lindsay, CEO at Lifeline Direct. Now, we're in a time in which digital is actually changing how people are reaching out for help. And if there are any organisations that are seeing this shift up close, it's got to be Lifeline. So it's such a privilege to be speaking with you today, Luke, listening to your stories behind the work that you do. Let's get to it.
Oh, well, thanks. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Maybe the first question we can start with is, how did you first get into this line of work and what pulled you towards content and communications and digital?
I've spent my whole career working primarily as a mental health clinician, working in suicide prevention and mental health clinical services. I started my career largely in the hospital and healthcare settings, in a tertiary setting, working primarily in mental health and drug and alcohol services. I worked across a number of different kind of clinical settings in that space. And what I found was often we were dealing with people in distress at the pointy end. So they were presenting to the emergency department or calling helplines. And when we looked in hindsight at their journey, often there were multiple opportunities to intervene really early on to reduce unnecessary distress. So I became very interested in early intervention. I moved into the not-for-profit sector with a focus on suicide prevention and helping people in distress. Found myself with Lifeline, initially with Lifeline Queensland for a few years. And over the course of the last 12 months, I've been with Lifeline Direct as the CEO.
Was there a moment for you when work stopped being a job and it became personal for you?
I've never viewed my role or roles kind of as a job. There's always been a driving force and a kind of passion behind what I do. And I think there's nothing better than being able to help support someone through what is often the worst day of their life. I think burnout is a real risk in the sector. And I think really robust supervision and debriefing and support is incredibly important to make sure we don't see clinicians and practitioners starting to burn out. We don't see kind of empathy, fatigue, and really making sure that we can give everything we can to the person who's seeking support in the moment.
Is it okay if I ask, how do you find yourself regulating for the role in a professional setting, making sure it doesn't take that personal toll?
Presence is incredibly important. I think anybody that reaches out for help, they want the person they're seeking help from to be totally present in that interaction. And so it's incredibly important when at Lifeline we pick up the phone, our crisis supporters are in a really good headspace. They listen with no judgment and just pure empathy. And that after that interaction or after that call, they then take the time to practice self-care. And in a Lifeline setting, that is through debriefing, that is through individual supervision, or that is through group supervision, and making sure they take the time to be able to be in the greatest headspace they can for that next call.
Have you got any anecdotes of where that's gone wrong? What does that mean for the person who's trying to play this really important role?
In a Lifeline setting, I probably don't have any anecdotes because we have an operating model where our crisis support staff come in, and a part of that shift is a check-in. How's your day? How are you feeling? How's your headspace? Are you ready for the shift? Is there anything we can help support you with before you're ready to take that first call? And a similar process, a check-out at the end of the shift. So it becomes the bread and butter of the start and the end of a shift.
Would you like to give us some numbers on how many people there are playing these support roles on the phones or digitally, and how many calls you might be getting?
Absolutely. So across the country, there's around 3,000 crisis support volunteers that work on the phones for Lifeline. Any given day, roughly, there's about 3,500 calls. We have a really fantastic workforce that is a mixture of digital crisis supporters who support people through our text and online chat services. And then we have our telephone-based or our voice crisis support team. And we have our team all over the country, working remote, working hybrid, working in centres. But there is a significant number of people required to be able to build and drive a workforce that makes sure, as a suicide prevention service, we're available 24/7 for people who need to reach out for help.
So you mentioned that you've got digital support teams, you've got support teams that are specifically for phones.
Yep.
Let's talk about digital. So what did that team look like, let's say, 10 years ago? What have you seen change in regards to how people are interacting with different channels for support?
I think some of the lessons that we've learned and some of the changing demographics of help seekers that have reached out through our digital channels over the years, we have seen a change. We've seen a change in the volume of usage and access of people reaching out from a digital perspective. We've seen a shift in the cohort of the type of help seeker that reaches out. When our digital channels first started, they were quite limited. So they were just kind of in the evenings into the late night. So there was just a portion of the day where digital services or a digital channel was available. Over time, with significant advocacy and support from different kind of government and funders, we were able to expand that digital services across 24/7, both through text and our online chat services. Now, at the moment, that is a dedicated digital crisis support workforce. So they are crisis supporters who train purely in digital support delivery and who only work in digital support delivery. What we've seen over the years, we tend to see a younger demographic reaching out through our digital channels, and there's a range of reasons for that. They're far more literate with the use of IT, it comes far more naturally to them. But we've also seen an element of safety in the use of digital as opposed to picking up the phone. And we know that often when people reach out for support for the first time, it is quite daunting, it's quite overwhelming to pick up the phone and to reach out to someone. But there's an element of reduced stigma in making contact through a digital channel. One of the other benefits is, from a confidentiality perspective, a lot of help seekers who reach out through our digital channels do so. They may be living in a share house and they don't want their roommates to overhear a call. They may be in an environment where safety is an issue. They may be in a domestic and family violent environment and it may be safer to reach out. Also, people with disabilities often find it safer and easier from an accessibility perspective to reach out for support through our digital channels as opposed to picking up the phone.
You mentioned safety before, so confidentiality, convenience, being able to get support in the moment. Could you elaborate a bit more on safety, the feeling of safety accessing help through digital channels?
Help seekers, by the time they actually reach out for help, particularly in that first time, they've often been thinking about it for a very long time. People talk about there's a few false starts where they might go and talk to the GP about it. The concept of trying to navigate a very complex mental health system can be overwhelming and they don't follow through. Often when people are so highly distressed, the concept of being able to jump onto Google and look at where do I reach out, where do I go, it is often less confronting to reach out through a digital channel than picking up the phone. People feel that it is potentially not as invasive in the moment. They often feel it's a simple and straightforward process and they don't have to physically speak to somebody. And we know that apprehension about reaching out for help is really important because that first experience when somebody reaches out for help needs to be a positive experience so that help seeker is more willing to reach out a second time or a third time should they need it. If somebody reaches out for help and they have a poor experience or they struggle to navigate the system, they're less likely to reach out for help again.
And I imagine that that has disastrous consequences. So if we look at the knowledge that you have of these cohorts, understanding who is using these channels, where are you getting the research from?
The development of the digital channels and the operating model is really robust and really evidence-based. We also know that even the concept of reaching out for support through a digital channel, for many people, can also be overwhelming. And so over the course of a number of years and through a co-design process, Lifeline has created a self-led, self-help channel on the website where people who are just starting to think about I'm worried about myself, or I'm worried about a family member or a friend. I'm not quite sure how to approach the conversation, particularly if somebody hasn't had any experience of suicidality or distress or mentally ill health. And so that self-led kind of self-help toolkit built into the Lifeline website allows people to navigate around that toolkit to look at some kind of behaviors and some symptoms. It helps build the mental health literacy of the individual to help them get to the point where they start to make decisions around then taking the next step to reach out for support. So that front end component that is safe, easy to navigate and accessible, because we know that with an increase in health literacy, people feel more equipped to then reach out for help, to use some of the language, use some of the terminology to help to advocate for their own individual needs.
Ever since introducing more of those self help resources or self assessments that help people feel more informed, have you seen a direct impact on maybe the reduction of calls or outreach to Lifeline Direct?
I don't think we could categorically say there's an association between an increase in traffic to the self-help toolkit and a reduction in contacts either through our voice or our digital services. But we do know there is continued growth in traffic to the self-help and kind of self-led toolkit. We know that when people are in distress, Lifeline is a brand that is synonymous with support. We know that it is actively and very publicly recognised as a safe brand for people to reach out. And so we have seen the numbers continue to rise kind of month on month of people accessing that. It is a really positive thing to see people pushing past the concept of stigma, starting to navigate some of the resources available either for themselves or for a friend or a family member or a loved one.
So, taking a look at those self help resources in the context of content development, what information are you sharing with help seekers? What advice, or if anything, would you share around where to get started and what's most important for content producers trying to create accessible, engaging health content?
What we know is that when people are starting to think about navigating getting support, that when they log on and they look at the website, and whether it's the Lifeline website or another health engine, we know it has to be accessible, we know it has to be simple, and we know that the content has to be evidence-based. The last thing we want is people making decisions around their healthcare based on health literacy or information that is not evidence-based. So accessibility, it's easy to navigate. It gives them options, because if they log on and they're looking for support for a friend or a loved one, but the only available resource is around support for them as an individual, they're likely to disengage and log off. So when they log on, they see a really simple homepage that gives them the option straight up. Are you worried about yourself or are you worried about someone else? Then it cascades out like a tree to really help you refine down to what it is that that individual is looking for. The other really important part is the use of language and terminology. The mental health and suicide prevention sector over the last 40 and 50 years has worked incredibly hard at the concept of stigma reduction. There are more people now reaching out for support than ever before. Language is such an important part of stigma reduction. The way in which language is used in resources, the way in which language is used in health literacy really helps to build a non-judgmental approach so that when people are reading, when people are looking at the resource to help inform them, that there's an appropriate use of language that doesn't stigmatize the concept of reaching out for help. Similar to media reporting of suicide-related incidents, there are national evidence-based mind frame guidelines that journalists and media use when reporting on suicide, with a very significant focus on the use of appropriate language to really encourage help seekers to reach out, and that stigma isn't a significant challenge or barrier because of an inappropriate use of language or terminology.
Are you able to give some examples? I imagine it's around being like non-judgmental, quite matter
Yeah,
of fact, but are there some examples of words to avoid, phrases that come up that you see time and time again?
absolutely. As an example, you'll often hear people refer to the concept of suicide by using things such as this person committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide. Now that conjures up kind of thoughts and feelings of failure when you use the word attempted suicide. And also the concept of committed suicide really conjures up what are very archaic feelings and concepts around suicide once being illegal. And also across many countries in the world, suicide is still illegal. So really started to reframe some of the terminology. So not that the person attempted to commit suicide or committed suicide, but actually somebody died by suicide. And there is contemporary language around the way in which we describe suicide or about the way in which we talk about suicide. And the Mindframe guidelines are the gold standard national guidelines around language and terminology when building content around suicide and mental ill health, and when talking about it in a public space or putting it out there for consumers and help seekers to access and be part of.
And are those guidelines something that you work on more internally, or is there a set that's publicly available?
The Mindframe guidelines are publicly available. They've got a strong evidence base behind them, and they are nationally recognised as the gold standard when it comes to language. Any health service, any organisation looking to build content around mental ill health, around mental illness, around suicide in particular, it's incredibly important to get the language right. And really looking at something like the Mindframe guidelines.
So, Luke, you mentioned that you've got a dedicated digital team and how important it is to give people access in a way that's simple and accessible. What kind of things are they doing behind the scenes there to make sure that these channels are working to the best of their ability and serving users? What mistakes have you seen them make or missteps with testing or rolling out products and services?
I think the biggest mistake any organisation that provides digital content around suicide prevention is designing the content without lived experience input. So if we have a team of people who have had no experience in accessing or using the mental health system or the suicide prevention sector, designing content for help seekers, it's never going to work. The co-design process of designing content with people who have used or do use those kind of services is crucial in getting it right. When designing content, the concept of it being accessible and simple is around the concept of navigation. If you think yourself, when you've tried to navigate accessing a health service, going to the GP, getting a referral, ending up on a wait list, having to call, having to register online, all of those processes are challenges and roadblocks that stop you from getting to where you need to be. We are potentially then removing an opportunity for someone to get the access to the support they need if we haven't created a system that is simple and clear to navigate in the context of somebody either being in distress or in crisis, and their willingness to be able to concentrate and focus and follow complex steps in a process being quite limited.
I really like the fact that you've highlighted how important it is to bring in that lived experience lens from the very start. And that is really what underpins the digital experience, because lived experience informs how someone is likely to seek help and navigate their way through all of the things that they need to do to feel better. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about what incorporating lived experience and what does co-design look like at Lifeline?
Specifically at Lifeline, there is a really important lived experience advisory group. And so across the entire organisation, lived experience is engaged from the outset when it comes to things like the development of policies and procedures, when it comes to the development or tweaks or changes to operating models in the way we deliver services and the way we support people, when it comes to things like recruitment and creation of roles and user experience, looking at our digital services and having direct input into the creation and development of models. The Lived Experience Advisory Group is incredibly important. It's a crucial part that works side by side with the executive and digital and operational management team in the development of all services and support activities across the organisation. You will find that most contemporary mental health and suicide prevention and even community service organisations started to embrace the importance and just how vital co-design with lived experience, and then continuing to use lived experience as part of the DNA of that organisation, not as a tokenistic afterthought, but actually at kind of the inception concept stage.
So having a lived experience board for that governance, making sure it's integrated. I imagine when there is user testing, product testing of those digital channels, that you're doing that with people with lived experience as well?
The lived experience advisory group, before anything moves into trial or a pilot phase, for example, the concept will be worked on with a lived experience lens in terms of the lived experience members' history of using services, what worked, what didn't, what they think would be best placed and what wouldn't. And often that's a really crucial step in designing something that's going to be set up for success and support help seekers from the outset rather than it being an afterthought.
Have you encountered any situations or learnings? Like, what have you learnt the hard way in your role at Lifeline that in hindsight you kind of wish, we probably could have done that differently?
I think an example was in a previous health service that I worked with, and it was really around creating an environment where police and ambulance or emergency services were well informed in terms of increasing their mental health literacy in the context of attending a significant number of mental health calls. And so when they were arriving on scene, often they didn't have the expertise or they didn't have the skill set necessary at the time to be able to help de-escalate that situation. There was a bit of a reactive process of creating some kind of training at the time for the emergency services workers. In hindsight, that training that was created in terms of the content, it was incredibly reactive. It didn't necessarily consider lived experience and the complexities around lived experience involvement. It also took emergency services personnel outside of their kind of scope of their role and outside of their practice. And so we didn't really necessarily see a change or any success from that. What we did was we brought back together a really broad ranging group of emergency services personnel from both police and ambulance, mental health clinicians, mental health specialists, and lived experience, people who had used emergency services to access mental health support before when they've been in crisis or when they've been in distress. And together collectively, there was some really beautiful collaboration around what works, what people using that service need from police or ambulance when they attend their home, what they don't need, what hasn't worked and what's actually made things worse, and to really start to create a content package to be able to upskill and support emergency services personnel. So they felt well informed. They'd heard directly from people who have used that service, directly from people who had had police or ambulance attend their home in the context of distress and a AAA related call, in terms of what helped and what didn't help. And it was that kind of lesson after the kind of failed first go that we didn't really see any change, that actually stopping, pausing, bringing all the right people together and starting to build and develop content that was not just based on a small subset of people, but actually it was a collaboration of a number of people involved in getting the best outcome for the people seeking support through emergency services calls.
You mentioned that it was reactive, maybe even a bit tokenistic. Can you give us some examples of why you thought it wasn't robust enough?
It was almost like we had prepared a script, and obviously a script isn't nuanced enough for the complexities of every individual presentation that ambulance and police were called out to. The training that was created was a very generic training, generically for people in distress, and it didn't factor in the range of different complexities of what our emergency services personnel are called out to. Younger people, older people, people that are highly distressed and experiencing significant suicidal ideation, as opposed to people that had just completely given up on trying to navigate a very complex mental health system. They were in complete distress. They struggled. There's a perception of failing to navigate a complex mental health system and felt their only option was to call O and be taken into an emergency department. We really had to start to build content around a range of different presentations, around a range of different de-escalation techniques, and around a realistic expectation that emergency services personnel do a fantastic job. They have a very clear role and function, and we don't expect them to be a mental health clinician in someone's home. The expectations was around how do we de-escalate a situation? What is in the best interest of that person who is called O? What are their immediate needs? What are the safety considerations? And how does the emergency services personnel get them to access support in a safe and timely way?
What signs did you see to make you decide that that initial effort wasn't working?
Some of the metrics at the time we looked at was user experience. So did the individual who was transported to the emergency department by police or ambulance, did they feel safe? Did they feel validated? Did they feel heard in the process? And the feedback often was no, they didn't. The other part was this model was established to look at, is an emergency department the right environment for this person? Because what we know is that people who are in distress, people who are in crisis, often a busy, bright emergency department is incredibly stimulating and can actually make things much worse for the individual. And there are a lot of other pathways for people to be able to follow depending on the hospital and the health service. There's kind of primary healthcare options, there's specialty telephone and telehealth based options, but often when people feel like they haven't been able to navigate any other options, there is often the case where people feel that is their only option.
Sounds like based on different points in your career, you've had some stories that have really stuck with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned scripts before, and I can imagine this is incredibly critical at Lifeline for the support team. In my work, there are some different trains of thought around how you might build empathy with somebody who is a help seeker. In some cases, you want to use inclusive language and make them feel acknowledged and heard by making them sound like you understand what they're feeling. On the other hand, sometimes saying, I know it must be hard, it can be a very jarring experience for the help seeker because they're like, you don't know what I'm going through. You don't get it. How dare you? And they close it off.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you, and how are you mitigating some of those different trains of thought?
To become a crisis supporter with Lifeline, there is an incredibly robust, evidence-based and comprehensive operating model called the CARE framework. That incorporates the training that all of our crisis supporters go through. And that training is staged from theoretical kind of face-to-face modules. It includes role play, it includes supervised practice calls and call coaching to get to the point where you achieve your accreditation and you can start picking up the phone and taking calls. As a help seeker reaching out to Lifeline, regardless of which help seeker picks up that phone to you, regardless of where they're located in the country, they are all operating under the same CARE framework. And that is around not providing clinical advice. That is around listening with empathy and without judgment. And that is around specific phrasing and terminology, because you're right. There are some people who would have a positive experience from hearing somebody say something like, I know how you're feeling, as opposed to a different take on that, which would be, that sounds incredibly difficult. Part of the experience with speaking with a Lifeline crisis supporter is around building rapport, feeling heard without judgment, and being able to have that warm interaction. It's not around giving advice. There are absolutely opportunities where a help seeker identifies that they need further care or ongoing treatment and intervention, where the Lifeline crisis supporter can help them identify services within their area and their region that may be beneficial for them. Consistency in the operating model, or consistency in the framework, and in the Lifeline context, that's the CARE framework. It's really, really important to be able to then work within the scope of the role of where the crisis supporters have been trained and know what those boundaries are.
Reflecting on your career, we've discussed some of the stories that have stuck with you, the scenarios and the things you've worked on. Is there something that maybe you started out believing, were you firm in, and now you've changed your mind about?
If I think about 25 years ago when I started out, people seeking support for mentally ill health, it was very much focused in the medical model. Now, that is nuanced to the fact that I've worked in a healthcare environment. So the concept of medication and therapy, talk therapy with a psychologist or a counsellor, for example, and medication kind of being the primary treatment. What I've seen really shift over the course of the last couple of decades is a broadening of that experience. There is absolutely still a place and a role for medication and talk therapy. But I think we've started to see some really significant and emerging evidence over the years around so many other concepts that support mental health. So the environmental factors in terms of the social determinants of health, things like housing stability, financial stability, the concept of social isolation and loneliness and the role that can play, and being part of a community, part of a club, or part of a sporting group, for example, and just how important that can be. The concept of gut health and food and nutrition and sleep hygiene, they have become incredibly important in the way people manage their well-being. And so I think what I've seen over the years is a real openness that everybody's individual journey is unique, and what works for some people won't work for other people. But really starting to explore options around what are some of the drivers behind suicidality? What are some of the drivers behind mental ill health? And really coupling that with a wide range of treatment options that are uniquely tailored to you and not a kind of one size fits all. And so I think over the course of the last couple of decades, I've seen a real expansion in treatment options, treatment modalities, individualized treatment. And it's been a real pleasure to watch.
And when you think about the future of communications and content in health, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that anybody in our community who wants to access support for their mental health, their well-being, or should they maybe experiencing kind of suicidal ideation, that support is available and accessible in the place they need, at the time they need, in the way they need it, and that it's not tied to politics, it's not tied to funding, it's not tied to differences depending on where you live. But if you live rurally, remotely, regionally, or in a capital city, that people have the same level of timely access to the right type of support at the right time, in the right way, when they need it. That is my absolute hope for the future.
Thank you, Luke. There was a lot in there that's so fascinating. I really appreciate you sharing those insights. Some key things you mentioned there for listeners. There are certain frameworks around language, care models. They could look them up if they're interested in learning more. There are also the self-help resources that you've produced, your team has produced for Lifeline that they can look up on the website. If there is any last words around where help seekers should go, I imagine it would just be to call up or find where to go on the Lifeline site.
Looking at the lifeline.org.au website gives people the opportunity to explore what options are available. It also gives them the direct opportunity to reach out through our digital channels, either through our text or online chat, or to pick up the phone and to call 13 11 14. Regardless of the way in which you choose to contact Lifeline, there is an opportunity and option for everybody to reach out for support.